Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. I'm so happy to have you with me today, and we have a very special guest, someone who has taken a very serious look at a serious part of our history, has dedicated more than 10 years to researching our history, and has put it in a book that is already a New York Times bestseller. Let me tell you about her. She is Antonia Hylton, a Peabody and two-time Emmy Award-winning correspondent for NBC News and MSNBC. With her work at Vice Media and HBO's Vice News Tonight, Antonia Hylton has been recognized for her incredible journalism. She has received so many awards, including Gracie Awards, a Namick Vision Award for reporting on violence and politics, and 2 Front Page Awards. She is known for addressing important issues with her podcast, South Lake, which recently earned a 2022 Peabody Award. But today, we are going to discuss her latest book that was just released in January, and as I mentioned, already a New York Times bestseller. It is titled Madness: Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. And between the pages of this book, it exposes the deep-rooted legacy of slavery in the treatment of Black individuals' mental health. We're going to talk all about it now, so please join me in welcoming Antonia Hylton.
Hey there. Thank you so much for having me, Harriette.
Oh, I'm so moved by your work, and for lots of reasons. In the beginning of your book, you talk about, you are honest about something that most people are not, that mental health struggles and challenges exist in your family. Now, Antonia, if we are honest, most people can say the same thing, and most people don't, especially in the Black community. But honestly, I'm going to say just generally, people don't want to admit that anybody could have any fragility in their emotional and psychic state of being. What made you decide to share that? You could have done this incredible book and not shared that, but you open up from the very beginning, acknowledging that there have been mental health challenges in your family.
I think it was a few things. The first is that, bringing a story like this forward and trying to engage the Black community to make Black Americans feel seen in this space, in the mental health care space, in a way that I think we really haven't been. As a student of the history of psychiatry, for example, I spent years studying this stuff, and really we're only told about it from the perspective of white Europeans and white Americans. And so if I'm going to do something, if I'm going to publish a work that situates us at the center of the story and asks the reader to destigmatize these issues, to be brave, to talk more about them, to think more about what's going on in your own family, well, then the least I could do was take that step along with you, right? And then I think the other thing too is, just journalistically as a reporter, we're trained to disclose any connection we have to a story. And that can be something simple. So if you're a business reporter and your family owns a powerful corporation, you should tell your readers that, because that's going to be part of what influences your reporting and part of why you know what you're talking about, right? And you want your reader to trust you. Well, if I'm going to be talking about the history of mental health care, you should know that I didn't just stumble upon this story and decide that, this asylum in the heart of the woods in Maryland, it sounds so interesting to me. I came to it from a real deep place of hurt, of longing, of searching for more support, more stories like ours, and that absolutely impacted all the decisions I made. So you should know that, and I'm inviting you into that experience with me, so that as you see me unfold and unpack the story, you understand a bit more about why I make the decisions that I make in this book.
Well, I think we certainly appreciate that. And also, it's a delicate balance, because you are not talking about yourself. There are members of your family, and this is a very confidential subject. Did you have to go to your family members first to kind of get their blessing? And how did you handle that?
Oh, yeah. So
And did anybody say, heck no?
That was my biggest fear, is that there would be people who said, heck no, or, oh my God, delete this or that, But actually, one of the amazing things about doing this work over the last 10 years is that I think that the research, the storytelling, the findings about other people, but another community in Maryland, about this hospital, actually helped my family begin its own journey to healing and discovery and to more conversation. So I used to come from a family that would say things like, pray about it on Sunday. We
Oh,
don't
yeah.
talk about those things. Go to your room. If you were feeling down or you were in an emotionally difficult place. And my family is now the exact opposite of that. I mean, a 180. People engaging and talking very openly about therapy, helping each other out, calling doctors on their behalf.
Mm.
During the pandemic, we had a weekly family Zoom where we would talk for hours just to check in on each other and support each other. And I think, or I know because my family has told me this, that the work that I did to tell the story of Crownsville Hospital at the center of this book made them feel less alone and made them feel a little bit more comfortable, starting very slowly. It was a years long process. This didn't happen overnight, but very slowly it made us address more of our own issues, our own skeletons. And so, the short answer is that no, I was actually shocked to find that my family was so excited and supportive of the story. And in particular, readers will meet at the very beginning a family member of mine who is actively struggling
Right.
and actively trying to get care because they were experiencing psychosis in the midst of the pandemic. And,
It happened
this
to
is
so many people.
it did. And so many Black American families of color are dealing with this with loved ones. And we're often made to feel like it's our fault somehow. It's a shameful thing. It's a secret we need to keep from our neighbors or our friends. But actually, once you experience it, you find out just how many other people are going through this too. And so the experience, I think, put my family in a place where we had one of two decisions to make. Either you decide you're going to change and address and heal and stop something, a pattern at the root, or you're going to run away from your problems and try to outpace them, outrun them. And what I've found in my work as someone who covers this and has seen it happen to so many other families and throughout our history, but also as someone who then was living it in their own family, the running, it doesn't work. Eventually it catches up to you and your family. And so we had no other choice but to become the kind of family that said, okay, we're going to put it all out there.
Well, we thank you and your family for it. It certainly is beneficial. I mentioned in the intro that you talk about this institution, Crownsville. By the way, I'm from Baltimore, and my family, part of my family is from the Eastern Shore. So I remember hearing about this place. I don't think it was in operation when I was a kid. Well, it closed, about 20 years ago, I think.
It closed in 2004.
So I was certainly living, but it wasn't so much that people were going there then, but there was the mystique about it. People knew about it. In Maryland, people certainly knew about Crownsville. And you write about this too. People would joke, family members would joke, if you don't behave, we're gonna send you to Crownsville. So it was like this place. But you talk about something that I think is so important for us to understand in our history. So many things happened immediately after the emancipation, so-called emancipation. We know that the prison industrial complex began immediately. This institutionalization of Black people began immediately. And so there are politics, economics, and straight up racism that occur from the beginning. And this particular facility, you describe that the Black people who were to be served there were forced to build it. And it was absolutely like slave labor. Can you explain that?
Oh, yeah. And when I share this story, people's jaws, they tend to drop. Because I think often we act as though we know everything about this period of American history. We're taught it in such particular patterns, right, in our schools in this country. But this is a story that I think still really shocks people's conscience. And Crownsville is created in both this unbelievably strange way, but also such an American way. They bring 12 Black men who are suffering with mental illnesses into the middle of a forest on March 13th, 1911. And those 12 Black men who are told that they are patients are brought into the woods, and there's no hospital for them. There's no place to rest. There's no therapy room. There is a doctor waiting for them, but that doctor's not about to give them any kind of treatment. He's actually going to really be their overseer. And over the next 3 seasons, those men and more are brought in every single week. They have to build themselves an asylum from the ground up. So they're in this cold
And these
forest.
are not construction workers. These are people suffering from some mental incapacity who are not builders, who become builders.
Right. Well, it raises some important questions, right? So, how can someone be so sick that they are no longer welcome in public, that they've been pushed out of their home, their school, they can't be with their family, with their loved ones? There's no other kind of facility that's able to support them or take care of them back in their own community. So, they've been brought here to the woods for that reason. But they're also so healthy, they're so okay that they can do 12 to 16-hour shifts a day moving railroads, clearing a forest, constructing massive brick structures that stand to this day more than a century later. They are doing the work of electricians and contractors, and constructing a hospital that has its own self-sufficient sewage and water treatment plants. They end up building a highly productive, very modern farm with irrigation practices.
Wow.
But they're so ill, they're not welcome home. And to me, that was one of the first red flags in my research, or really just a clear tension point that I knew I needed the reader to understand up front. And so, part of the argument of this book is that for that story, that origin, tells us so much about how we've been treated in this system that we couldn't even get healthcare without being told we had to do it for ourselves. We weren't deserving of this without first having to put the labor up front. And then that our health would be measured by the people who were in charge of us, taking care of us, supposed to give us care. It would be measured in our capacity to labor for them, to do more for them, to produce things for them, and to offset the cost of our own care, because that's what we see in the book, not just in the construction of the hospital itself, but then in the farm that they run. And then that patients are forced to make things like baskets and rugs and sell them to offset the costs for the hospital.
And you have photographs, really amazing photographs that you discovered in your research that show the basket making and the building. And I mean, they documented it. They were proud.
They weren't. And that's the thing I think too, that people sometimes are surprised by. They tell us not to necessarily judge the past by what we know today. But actually, one of the things I find in the record, and I show people, because this book weaves everything from oral history to hospital records to writings and letters by the people who were running some of these operations in the state, is that you see debates over some of the decisions that they've made. You see them publicly comment on them. We see, for example, that in those early years at Crownsville, they make the decision to not create a tuberculosis ward. So what that means is that any patient who has tuberculosis in the early 1900s who is Black is going to get to live among the general population and therefore make a lot of other people sick, and it leads to a lot of patient deaths. But we know, because those same doctors knew how bad tuberculosis was, that they make the decision at all the white hospitals to create a separate ward for tuberculosis patients to keep everyone else safe. So they're making these very clear decisions about how they're going to treat Black people versus how they're going to treat white people. And it's not necessarily something we can just say, oh, we didn't know as much then, or they didn't know how to treat patients who were suffering in these ways. They actually did have a lot of information and understanding about the challenges that they were facing in many cases, but they decided to do less for Black people consistently.
It's heartbreaking and a common thread. I mean, again, we're looking from the end of slavery. This hospital started being built, what, in 1912?
So it opens in 1912, but the day that those patients are marched into the woods is in 1911.
So from 1911, that's not that many years past the end of slavery. People are still trying to figure it out.
That's right.
And trying to contain people. So you have accounts in the book that describe the fear that Black people would, be free, and then there would be the degradation of humanity, which was another part of why, yes, there were some people who truly had mental illness, but there were a lot of people who were put into that position who were not mentally ill, but they just wanted to get them off the street. That is so crazy. Before you answer this, let me remind folks, this is Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. We are so honored to talk to Antonia Hylton today, and she has written a book that she spent 10 years working on. It is titled Madness, Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. And it is a must read. Thank you, Antonia, for creating this book.
Of course. really is my honor. And, you're right. The records, they really do, they reveal so much about the ways in which slavery and the history of the country seeped into everything, into our healthcare system. Often when people think about Jim Crow, when they think about the decisions our country made after slavery, they think about things like separate water fountains in schools. Those are some of the obvious examples people are familiar with.
And the lunch counter. We think about the, being
exactly.
able to, right.
But simple decisions like what to do with someone who is mentally struggling, that it had seeped into all of those spaces as well. I tell the story at one point of a patient who's brought to Crownsville for the crime of cutting a white person off in traffic. And what that case told me, right, is that because of the way they viewed Black people and the power and social structures at the time, any decision a Black person made that was seen as disrespectful to white people, outside of them knowing their place, that could be a way to label them as insane. If you don't know the way things work here, right? Clearly you don't understand your place. And therefore, if you've taken this action, you think you can cut a white person off in traffic, you must be crazy. So we're going to send you to a place like Crownsville. I tell the story of a man named Mr. Bell, who's found by one of the first ever Black employees who starts to come to the institution in the 50s. And she's just a young woman at the time. She's still alive and in her 90s. Her name's Marie Goff. And she comes into Crownsville and she meets Mr. Bell. And he tells her that he hasn't seen the sun or the sky in a very long time. So she takes him outside and she starts to get to know him, and she looks into his records. And she finds out that her own white supervisor had scooped him up in Baltimore one night with the help of the authorities because they had overheard him using a British accent. And they didn't believe there were any Black British people. And so they think he's crazy. He's using a fake accent, and they bring him to Crownsville. Well, it turns out this man had been born in London. He had been a jockey and had come to the United States and fallen on hard times. And because he didn't have loved ones or much in the way of connections here, he ends up lost to Crownsville for years and years and years. And so you're right that there's, there is a population there, absolutely, of people who were really searching for mental health care and in many cases denied proper care. But then there's a whole population of patients there that don't have any real mental health diagnosis at all, actually. And they are just Black people who are seen as outside of the status quo, outside of what white America imagines a Black person should be. And because of that, they're at risk of ending up incarcerated, essentially, and lost to a system like this asylum.
The language that is used to describe things. Well, let's start with you. You title your book Madness. So, obviously that draws our attention, but it also was used during that time to describe people's state of mind. There's a report that you describe in the book that's called the lunacy report. The language, now we live in a PC world. You can't say crazy. You can't say lunatic. You can't say somebody's mad, but I appreciate that you titled your book Madness and that you tell us about the language that is used to describe people, because it certainly gives a sense of the judgment that is placed upon people. There was no compassion shared in your book when you're going through all these records up until you see some of the Black people coming in. Compassion is not what I read as I'm reading through the pages in your book. Can you talk about just the attitude and the approach that they had and how language figured into that?
Language is so important. So I thank you for that, because it's one of these themes that, as a reporter, you hope people see and that they feel, but you don't necessarily hit them over the head with. But it's so important because, especially when you're talking about the different treatment of Black patients, of female versus male patients, language and these descriptive cues that people use, they can completely transform the decisions we make about how we're going to treat people. And so, I actually have had readers reach out to me and say, well, is Madness, your title, is it a reference to the patients? And I tell them, no, it's a reference to everything but the patients. It's a reference to this system and to the culture and to the decisions that we've made as a country. And actually, in one of the parts of the book where I think language is so important is where I look at the language people use to describe Black patients at Crownsville versus white patients at some of the nearby peer hospitals. And there's a period during the 50s coming out of World War II where the hospital system has been, really sapped. A lot of bright minds have gone overseas. The hospitals are struggling. They don't have a lot of resources, and they're trying to do a lot with a little. And that applies to everyone, but Crownsville is suffering the most because it's received the least funding from lawmakers who chose not to support it. And so what you see are all these riots and complaints from patients. And the language that white reporters use to describe the riots or misbehavior of patients at Crownsville is very aggressive and racialized. They do a lot of descriptions of young, Black, sort of highly sexualized males who they describe as being potentially threatening to all the white neighbors of the institution, particularly white women. They tend to position the Black male patients at Crownsville as a direct threat to white moms or grandmothers or women whose husbands are away. And there's a very clear picture being painted there. But then when white male patients either commit crimes themselves or also escape, because as you know, at one point I show records showing that actually the escapes were pretty equal across the board.
Right.
They use very different language, like, oh, this patient walked away without permission. And so when you describe people as kind of making a silly mistake versus people as being a very almost animalistic sexual threat, you're painting a very clear picture for communities, right? And so then what will that community do? Well, what the white neighbors of Crownsville did was they advocated for more carceral-like punishments for the patients. They wanted to build a wall. They wanted to add more chains and locks to the hospital instead of funding things like more therapists and more employees and more support for the patients. But they weren't advocating for walls around the white institutions, even though actually, if you looked at the data, a lot of the same issues, a lot of the same mistakes by patients were being made. But when you paint a picture that one person is a much more existential threat to you, you're going to take action and you're going to advocate in a very different way. And so language is very powerful in these cases.
And you do a really good job of letting us see that, which language is everything to me. It informs the way that we see things. And so this research, you did so much research. There are all of these records that you're finding them and then you're synthesizing them and making sense of them. How did you begin that process of even finding all of this information? Because it's not like it was just handy.
Oh man, it was a journey. And the state of Maryland was not at times very supportive. They didn't want to make it necessarily easy for me. And so I was just a teenager at the time. I was in college and I had fallen in love with the history of psychiatry, and I had found out about Crownsville and knew I needed to tell this story. At first, it was sort of an academic project. Over the years, it became clear that it needed to be something more. But I started petitioning the state of Maryland for permission to get in there. And they gave me kind of a checklist of things I would need to do. So you're going to need to go through an institutional review board process. So essentially sort of an ethics exam. You're going to need to prove to us that you can responsibly handle patient records and human subjects stories. And, you're going to need to do some studying and preparation for that. So I did it. And I thought, okay, I've checked the box. They're going to let me in there. Oh, we're going to need a couple other documents signed. You're going to need to do this and that. Okay, I did it. I kept checking these boxes, but still not getting permission to go. I had to get professors at Harvard to send some letters on my behalf to really help me apply some pressure there. And eventually I got permission to go. And then when I arrived, what I found sort of still shocked me. The state hadn't been upfront with me about the fact that they had actually destroyed a lot of the patient records, and that there was very little in the way that had survived that actually told you a lot about the patient's interior or personal lives. A lot of what survived were the priorities and the writings of white employees who, in those early decades, had very bigoted views of the people that they were supposed to take care of. And so immediately when I was faced with all this, and I have, hundreds of pieces of paper piled up on, sort of library style table, communal table in the archives in Maryland, going through it, I'm excited to find what's there, and I'm recording and diligently kind of copying over everything I can. But I also am really hit with the fact that I am going to need to launch a massive oral history project. Yeah. Because if I just take their word for it, if I just tell you the story of Crownsville through the eyes of the people who created Crownsville, who had so little faith in Black people and Black patients, well, I'm not really going to be telling you the truth. I'm not actually going to get the story right. And so I had to start the painstaking work of building close relationships with one family after another in Maryland who would start to share their own personal records with me, their personal stories. I was able to connect with patients, like the story of a woman named Sonia King, a former patient at Crownsville, whose story I tell across a couple chapters of the book. And to get people to open up to you about some of the hardest times in their lives, whether it's an employee who witnessed really difficult things there, or it's the patient who truly lived it. um, People don't just answer your first phone call and let you into their home
Right.
the first time you knock on the door. You really have to earn that. And so that's why this book took 10, 11 years to make, because every new person I met, they would open one more door and then one more door and then one more door. And it really wasn't until around 2020, 2021, well, so much was going on in the world, and I think a lot of black people's mental health, our mental health was suffering, that I finally felt I have enough here to finally tell you the story properly. And so I see it really as a balance with the records. The institutional records have to be married with that oral history to bring you the full story.
Well, and this is where your journalism prowess comes in, because this kind of book could easily be boring or laborious to read. I mean, just there's so much information, and it's not. You share a compelling story. I think the way you weave in personal stories and accounts of what has happened definitely holds the reader's attention, which is very important. To go through some harrowing information, I mean, it's hard to read some of it because it's so difficult to see, and also, Antonia, to see that some things haven't changed at all. I mean, when the way that Black people are perceived, the way that the choices that are made in terms of how we are described, the lack of compassion, the belief that Black men, no matter what their station in life, are a threat. These things were true starting before these institutions, because they needed to be true during slavery in order for them to justify that behavior, and remain true, which you show in your book. There's some biases and ways of looking at people that simply haven't changed. I'm curious, for the people who you interviewed, so for the professionals who work there, as well as people who may have been institutionalized, when you first, well, not just first, but in engaging them, were they grateful to be able to talk about it? Was it incredibly painful? Or, all of the above? What was it like for them? Because a lot of times people just say, I'm not talking about that anymore.
Yeah. There was a mix, but I would say the majority of people were really grateful. And I have to tell you, one of the things as a reporter that shocks me a bit about this is that the hospital closed in 2004. I was a child then. I would not have been qualified to begin work on this at that time. But there were lots of reporters at the Washington Post, at the Baltimore Sun, who could have, and they didn't. They didn't call the Black community and ask them how they felt about this. They didn't start telling patient stories. And so when I was in college, I think one of the reasons why people actually answered the phone when a 19-year-old was calling them was because they were looking to tell the story and no one had cared to listen. And in a way that shocked me, because this is a huge institution, it had been around for almost a century. You would think that there would have been a whole community of people in the DMV area of reporters dying to tell that story.
Sure.
But actually, part of the story of madness and of the hospital is a story of a Black community that has time and time again needed to love on itself, save itself, reform its own institutions, because there's a larger power structure around it that doesn't care to listen to them, that doesn't value their voices. And that structure is part of what actually produces poor mental health outcomes, that makes people feel lonely and paranoid and afraid. But that power structure is also what then denies them the opportunity to even tell their history. And so I think that's what made the opening for me as such a young reporter at the time to get in there, because other people had simply just forgotten to do it. And so there were certainly people who needed to take time. There are a couple of people in the book who waited 5 to 7 years to talk to me, who really were unsure they wanted to share their stories. But I think they saw how persistent I was and how dedicated I was. And they saw, okay, everyone else I know has talked to her. I guess I'll talk to this girl. But then there were a lot of other people who, when I came to see them, they would cry and tell me, you know, why are you the first person to ask me these questions? No one came to us. No one earned our trust. And that makes me a bit emotional to this day. Um, yeah. And so I feel very honored that they let me into their homes. I actually just this past weekend went to visit a lot of the elders who make up this book. And I had lunch with all of them and just gave them all hugs and thanked them for trusting me. Because I really have been able to sit with these last few months, how special that is. And so, I think that listening to people and showing people that you care and that you will keep showing up, that's often the key to really good journalism and storytelling. And I think other people could have done it. I don't think that I necessarily had some special skill set other people didn't have, but I was just one of the first people to care to let them speak and to tell their side of the story.
We're grateful that you did. Hey, everybody, this is Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. We are talking to Antonia Hylton. She has written the New York Times bestseller, Madness, Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. And this asylum is in Crownsville, Maryland. That's what it was called, Crownsville, and was open for how long, Antonia?
93 years.
93 years.
Closed in 2004, within our lifetimes.
I mean, it's amazing. And it was created for Black people who were called insane, which, again, the language, we don't use that language today. Well, some people don't use that language today, but just this was a place that, theoretically was to take care of these souls who had some kind of mental incapacity, but they were mistreated. I mean, there's so many stories that you share in the book of people coming in for a particular reason, it almost being incarcerated because they couldn't get out. The family members could often not come to see them. And then there was a time, and you described, there was a time in America when mental institutions became criminal justice system facilities as well. Can you talk about how that happened and what that meant for Crownsville?
Yeah, that's a really important part of the book. And for me, it was one of the messiest but most interesting parts of the story to tell. So, there's this fascinating part or period in American history. Coming out of the 60s, these new medications become available. I think a lot of us are familiar with them now. Anti-anxiety, antipsychotic medications that today pretty easy to get, but at the time were brand new and really shocking and surprising to people. And there's all this new media in popular culture. Films are coming out, like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and people are talking more about mental health, mental illness, and they want to destigmatize these issues. So there's a huge push to start to bring patients home, to care more about their rights, their civil rights, their access. And then JFK comes forward and has this whole plan to really improve community mental health care and to shut down the old asylum system. And so there's this idea of kind of an enlightenment happening. But one of the things that I think is really important for people to understand in Madness is that for Black people, that enlightenment really didn't apply the same. This idea that the sympathy and the support was very prevalent for white patients, but it was not as readily available to us. And that's because in the same moment that they're destigmatizing the broader story of mental health, there is the Black power, the civil rights movement happening. And Black people are starting to be criminalized, arrested, beaten in the streets for all kinds of protests, complaints, concerns, fears, pain, horrors that they are living. And the state is having a very aggressive response to them. And so Black people are getting sent to places like prisons or in jails, or to places like Crownsville because of their complaints about this country. And in a way, Black people start to kind of be pathologized at the exact moment that people are pushing to actually stop pathologizing so many patients. They are being pathologized in ways never seen before. And that culminates in stories like there's a chapter called The Curious Case of the Elkton Three. Three civil rights protesters who end up sent to Crownsville because they are labeled by a court as being crazy for the crime of trying to eat at a white-owned restaurant. And I think that tells you so much about where our country was in that moment and how mental illness can almost be used as a weapon against Black Americans when we try to talk about our concerns, our beliefs, our desires, the ways in which we want to reform and change this country. And so it's a very complicated period. And so instead of, I think, telling the basic story a lot of people are familiar with about how all the hospitals closed down and then we were more enlightened and we let them back home. Well, actually, if you look at what happened to Black patients, we started to arrest them and to pathologize them. We started to bring them into places like Crownsville, but also to prisons and jails. And then our leadership, both at the state level and at the federal level, as Nixon and Reagan come into power, they start to stop supporting mental health funding. And they start to put more money into prisons and jails. And I think many Black people are very familiar with what happens after that. But let's bring it to the current moment, right? Maryland is still the state that has a higher portion of Black men incarcerated than any other state in the country. And so these patterns are really important to understand. Any era we're in is built upon the era that comes before it. And so people need to better understand this period. Because when you look at the system we have now, where so many of us can't find doctors who look like us, can't find programs that we feel truly support us, don't feel heard, don't feel listened to, even when we come forward and we say we're struggling. But then we know so many people who are getting caught up into the other half of the system, which is the much more punitive one. You know, these are not mistakes, they're not coincidences. There are decisions, there are choices that were made. And that word choice is really important. I always emphasize it because it's really important for people to understand that there are these periods in history you can go back to and look at when we flipped the switch, when we went down the path, we chose left or right. And that period, that very messy period of deinstitutionalization, but also the explosion of the criminal justice system, is a really important one because we were the people at the center of that change. Yeah. They were making a lot of those decisions based on their beliefs about us.
You know, I remember I was in college when Reagan was in office, and he closed many mental health institutions. I mean, I don't remember what the law was, but that was the period right after of what they call bag ladies. And there were thousands of people in mental institutions who were let out onto the streets. They had no one, they had nowhere to go. They started carrying their belongings in paper bags that were like supermarket bags. And people joked about it. When you think about it, it was just an awful thing to say. But again, language. There were certainly more Black people on the street than others. And he was congratulated for it. But as I was thinking about this and reading your book, you know, there's so much in this. On the one hand, it is important to have these institutions when they're doing the right thing to help people, to support people. If their families can't take care of them, that there's a place where they can get shelter and care. On the other hand, when they aren't being taken care of well, you don't want them there. But throwing them on the street is certainly not a viable solution. So I'm curious, in your research, how do you, and in your synthesis of the research, how do you reconcile what occurred? Because it doesn't seem like anything good yet has come out of this.
Well, you know, when we look at what we currently have, a lot of Black Americans, their first brush with the mental health care system happens when they're in the back of a jail cell. That's the first time that they're connected with a doctor who maybe diagnoses them with something, recommends a certain medication to them. And so in many ways, we've pushed off mental health care to our prisons and jails. In many communities, the largest provider of mental health services is a prison or a jail. There is no other place with as many beds and as much space for patients as those locations. I think that says a lot about what we've decided to do about mental health care. And, you know, the other piece is there are a lot of Black physicians, doctors, psychiatrists who have been screaming from the rooftops in recent years, trying to share their ideas about what they think we should do. And often what I hear is that there was a middle choice. There was something else we could have done. You know, we could have scaled the hospitals down to create more specialized units. So a lot of doctors tell me that they think that there should be, the same way that we have hospitals that specialize in pediatric cancer, breast cancer, leukemia. You know, you don't just go to any hospital when you're diagnosed with any kind of cancer. You're trying to find the experts, right?
True.
That we could have created a system, a mental health care system, modeled in that same way. So you're going to find specialists who work with, your community who understands schizophrenia, particularly bipolar disorder, manic depressive disorder, who specialize in working with children who are dealing with anxiety, that we would have funded and created a different structure here that maybe would have actually used and borrowed some of the good aspects of the old hospital system, but also would have done away with a lot of the big warehousing, sort of overgeneralizing aspects of that system. And then, the other option was to have put a lot more money into the community mental health promise that had been made to all of us, and that just never really materialized and essentially fell apart during the 70s and 80s. And so, these are things that we could do. There are politicians, there are leaders we could go to now and demand that they introduce legislation, that they try to put money up behind the programs and the ideas that these people have had for a very long time. But it's very hard to get people to listen. And one of the reasons I think that is, from my reporting and my observations, is that I think that so long as we're all in this place of shame and stigma, and there is still a discouragement of talking about these issues publicly, or in seeing ourselves in other people and in communities that are different than ours, that it's going to be very hard to create a constituency that puts pressure on our leaders to actually do something. So long as we all feel the shame internally by ourselves, we will not go out and create a larger group that makes our elected officials feel like they need to do something about mental health. So then they blame it for things like, mass shootings. And it's a convenient excuse at those times. But then it's not something they really need to do anything about because they don't feel like there's a voting base that they need to respond to. And that's kind of the tough moment we're in, where there's a lot of contradiction in that. On the one hand, everyone talks about self-care and therapy and self-improvement all the time. But it's become this individualized thing. Like it's all on us to just be by ourselves and do some breathing exercises and figure it out. When actually it's a collective issue. We got here through collective mistakes and errors and tragedies. And so, I think the sooner that we recognize that if we all kind of saw that every single community and every kind of person has a touch point right now, especially after the pandemic, for the struggle, the pain, the trauma that is trying to get access to mental health care in this country, the sooner we recognize that, the sooner we would get something done.
So, Antonia, what is your call to action that you hope will occur when people read Madness? What do you hope will happen?
Well, the first is that I hope that people feel less alone. I hope that in hearing these stories and seeing the long history here, especially if you are a person of color, that you will feel less alone in the struggles that you or your family may be facing, and that you also maybe have some more compassion for members of your family who have been very anxious about healthcare, mental health care, about reaching out to therapists or psychiatrists. I think when you see and you feel this history, you'll understand where they were coming from. You'll actually understand that they were making what they saw as a logical choice. They were trying to protect themselves or you when they made the decision to maybe not approach these systems. So that's one of the first things that I try to tell people. The second is I want people to understand that I think that in the current moment, there are a lot of people invested in us believing that there's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do about how many Americans don't have homes. There's nothing we can do about how many shootings are going to happen in public or at schools. That mental health is kind of just this big, broad, amorphous thing that we're all going to have to live with in the modern world, and there's nothing we can do. But the truth is actually, when you look at this history, there's a whole lot we can do. And there are a lot of really brilliant doctors and nurses who are trying to point the way to something better. And so my hope is that when you read this book, we will listen more closely to them. We will put them in positions so that they can influence what happens next. And that it will also just remind people that we can dream of, that we can work towards something better. We don't have to accept things as they are right now. Because when I travel the world, the country as a national reporter right now, I hear from people, rich and poor, white and black, that they are unhappy with the system. And so there is a community there. There is, I think, something bubbling there under the surface. I think people don't know where to point their efforts. I don't think they don't know yet who to go to. But I think we're on the cusp of something. And I hope my book gives people the tools to do something about it.
I think it can. I really do. I mean, it's a powerful book, Madness, Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. Antonia Hylton, thank you for spending all the years you have in creating this book. It's clearly a labor of love and, your expertise as a journalist, which we appreciate because it comes across really beautifully. Thank you for sharing this story with us. And I hope that people will accept your call to action, and perhaps we can create better spaces, safer spaces for people to get the care that they need. So congratulations, and thank you for talking to us.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Dream Leapers with Harriette Cole. Get your copy now of Madness, Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum by Antonia Hylton. It is a powerful book. You'll want to talk about it with your family. I always love when we can have those discussions with the people we love about something that's important. So until next time, have a great day and make it count.